Welcome to Hope is Here. My name is Greg Horn. Is there someone in your life that has really hurt you and you know that you need to forgive them, but sometimes the pain is so overwhelming that you feel like you just can't go there? Well, this week you're going to hear an incredible story of forgiveness between a son and his father. My guest this week is Jason Romano, who recently wrote an incredible book called Live to Forgive, Moving Forward When Those We Love Hurt Us. For those of you who are sports fans, Jason was an Emmy Award-winning producer and senior manager at ESPN for almost 17 years, and then he transitioned to a new career a couple years ago at Sports Spectrum, a website, magazine, and podcast that connects both sports and faith together. And he started a podcast in March of 2017 that already has over 500,000 downloads. And Jason's a great follow on Twitter. He talks about two of my favorite topics, Jesus and sports. So you can follow Jason on Twitter simply at Jason Romano. That's at Jason Romano. Well, Jason, one of the things I know that we're going to be friends, even though I loved your book, was blessed on that because we have a couple things in common. One of them is that we're both Dallas Cowboy longtime suffering fans, and then also enjoy the music of Mercy Me, man. So you've got good taste, buddy.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Greg. First of all, thanks for having me, and I'm really excited to be on with you. But, yeah, I say long-suffering Cowboys fan. I'm old enough, and it sounds like you might be too, that you know, I grew up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s with the Cowboys, so we didn't do a lot of suffering then, but it's been a long time, since 24 years, I think, since they won a championship, and I'm starving here for some success, so let's go Cowboys.
Well, we're a little extra excited here, Cowboy fans here in Kentucky, because one of the free agent signings was Randall Cobb, who's one of the all-time UK football greats. We don't have a lot of those, but he is one, so we're hoping maybe Randall Cobb can be a big target and a lot of help to the Cowboys this season.
Yeah, if he can even do about 80% of what he did in Green Bay with Aaron Rodgers, I'll be a happy guy, that's for sure. We'll be watching him closely.
All right. Well, Jason, I loved your book. I read it. It was hard to put down. And, man, you just hit a topic that I know so many people that listen, and part of the reason maybe they've lost hope is because they're just struggling to forgive somebody. Why did you write this book about forgiveness?
You know, it's something that I really didn't have plans to do. I was never a great writer. At least I didn't think I was. I didn't enjoy writing. I was always, you mentioned ESPN, I was always a producer, a content guy. I was, the guy that wanted to produce the content, not necessarily write it myself. And when it came time, though, to consider this book, it really came down to a couple factors. Number one was seeing where my dad was at this point when I wrote the book, 3 or 4 years into his sobriety, and understanding that our relationship had been really strained and very much a roller coaster for years and years and years. So it was that point that I thought, okay, my dad's in a good place now. But then the idea for the book came from a pastor who lives in California, and him and I were talking, we're friends, and I told him how I had started to share this story a little bit publicly with the congregation at the church that I go to. I had written a small blog about my dad previously in 2014, and I just started to get the story out there, and he told me, he just point blank said, you need to write a book on this. You need to do this. This is important. And I laughed at him. I said, there's no way I'm going to write a book ever. And he said, no, you don't understand. You need to write a book because it can help a lot of people. And that's really when my mindset changed, and I realized that if this book could help one person, and God wanted to see it through and wanted it to happen, then I needed to kind of pursue it. And that's exactly what took place. And over a 1.5-year process, I started writing the book and got a publisher who wanted to publish it and believed in the story. And in January of last year, the book came out, and it's been helping people since. And it's been amazing to see and hear people's stories of reading it. And even when I go and speak and share at churches and conferences, hearing other people's stories of forgiveness and understanding that, you know what, I'm not alone and they're not alone as we walk through this whole life journey together.
Well, I think that's the beautiful thing about your book, especially for us men, that you've allowed people, like you said, to be able to say, hey, wow, I thought I was the only one that had an alcoholic parent, and yet,
Yes.
the enemy, that's one of his great lies, because a lot of people have suffered through the devastation of a parent that suffered with alcohol. Have you found that to be true in all the speaking at conferences that you do?
Yeah, there's a lot of shame, I think, and a lot of embarrassment for a lot of people, not only the people who've done the hurting or are addicts, in the situation of my dad. And I've hurt people too, so that's not fair to say just my dad, but the ones who had to forgive and who've been hurt and had to enter a place where they're bitter and angry and moving forward into a place of healing. And I've seen that it's a real epidemic. It's almost a silent epidemic. There's quite a few silent epidemics out there because the enemy is very clear and conniving and telling us to just suppress our anger, suppress our bitterness, suppress our shame, and not tell anybody about what we've been through or have gone through. And for me, when I finally started sharing it, it wasn't something I was proud of course, and I had to be careful. I didn't want people to know that I was forgiving my dad as sort of a bragging type of thing. But as I started to share it and started to get a little more in detail about the things that I went through and walked through, that opened up opportunities and doors for other people to do the same. And that's really what it's about, in our relationship with God. He doesn't like secrets, and I think he doesn't like his children to have secrets because there's really no place for healing or forgiveness or reconciliation or any of those sort of words that you would hear. There's no place for those if you're hiding things. And so for me, it was important to get that story out there, I think, because I thought it could help people. And through that, it has helped people. And other people have come and shared their stories with me, and it's helped me. So it's been a really neat process.
Just tuned in. We're talking with Jason Romano. He is the author of a new book called Live to Forgive, Moving Forward When Those We Love Hurt Us. Jason, in your book, you broke it down into 4 main sections. First one was feeling the pain. The next section was evaluating the trauma. The third section was transforming the wound. And the last one was forgiving the abuser. Let's talk about the feeling the pain section. Can you share about that October day in 1984 when you were 11 years old, and man, you were so excited because you were going to your first NFL game?
Yeah, it's interesting. The process of putting the book together and sort of breaking it up into 4 parts was not something that, again, I had planned. But as I started putting the stories together, I realized that this is really what the process of forgiveness was like for me. And it goes back to when I was 10, 11 years old in 1984, and my dad and my stepmom, Patty, and my 2 brothers and I were informed that we were going to get to go to a football game for the very first time in person. And we grew up as a sports family, and my brothers and I, even though they were 6 and 8, I think at that time, or 7 and 9, they were big sports fans, just like I was. And my dad is a big sports fan. So to be able to go and see 2 NFL teams play a game in person was incredible for a young boy. And, my dad's a huge Giants fan, and that's where we went to see the Giants against the Eagles. It was Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia. I'll never forget it, the old vet. And I walked into that stadium, and it was like walking into Disney World for me. It was this huge, giant stadium that held 60, 70,000 people, and it was incredible. But as excited and as awesome as it was to walk in there, even as a young boy, I remember that joy turning into sadness and confusion in a lot of ways very quickly. Because that was the first time I really remember seeing my dad intoxicated, drunk. And, we were sitting in an area called the 700 level at Veterans Stadium, which is like the upper deck area. And that was always known for producing some hostility among the fans, we'll just say. And beer certainly played a part of that. Alcohol certainly played a part of that. And my dad, unfortunately, got caught up in that. And he had been drinking, and some Eagles fans were yelling at him, and he was yelling back, and some profanities were shared, and it wasn't the greatest memory for me or experience. And I remember being scared. I remember being confused, and it really took away from an experience that should have been this incredible memory for a young boy going to a football game for the first time. But then it got worse. Once my dad and his wife Patty and my brothers and I got into the car to leave, from that game, my dad was driving drunk. And this is a time in the mid-'80s when it started to come into play that driving drunk wasn't cool. And you started to see sort of these campaigns by different political people, that it's not cool to drive drunk. And but at that time, my dad was just doing it. He got in the car and he drove home, and it was a very scary 4-hour drive back home to Ravenna, New York, where I grew up from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Swerving, lots of screaming between my dad and my stepmom, and just, like I said, a really confusing time and a really scary time for myself and my two brothers.
Yeah, I could feel the just anxiety that you had when I was reading your book there. And you talked about on that ride back home that it was chaotic, confusing, and complicated. And you said that kind of summed up your childhood and adolescent years. So, man, that had to be kind of tough.
Yeah, it was. It was, at 10, 11, it was one of those situations where it was really the beginning of the feeling the pain process that I write about in the book, because that's when I started to wonder, is this going to be how it's always going to be? At that age, you want your dad to be someone who's there for you. To backtrack, my parents divorced when I was 6 years old, so I have very little memory of my mom and dad, if any, of my parents being together. So I always had this sort of void of mom and dad not being together, and my dad not living in the house that I grew up in, when I was a kid. So I would spend time with him on the weekends. I would spend time, with him when we were basically allotted to hang out with him. And, you wanted that time to be as special as it could when you were younger. And there weren't really great memories as a kid. My dad would try to do stuff with us, but his alcoholism really started to kick in so badly that it just affected every aspect of our lives. And it's funny when we talk about sports, because I write this in the book, the very thing that should have brought us together, which is sports, was actually what tore us apart, because the alcohol and the drinking and the times that my dad would be really in a bad place usually surrounded something to do with sports or a game. And it took what I had found so much joy in, and I still do to this day, love sports, but it took that joy of sports and really just completely turned it upside down in a way that just allowed me to not want to be a part of the things that he was enjoying, it's in the sports world. And that alcohol turned him into a different person too. So it was a very difficult time of growing up. And especially as I look back, I think it was even more difficult than I realized when I was going through it.
Well, we've only got about a minute left in today's program, but I want to close this, and we'll transition into it tomorrow. But you talked about, your emotions can be insights into reality. And I know for men that, we don't like to go into that word emotions. But for you, man, I thought you did a great job in this book highlighting about how important it is to deal with our emotions. Can you talk about that just for a minute? Yeah,
emotions, it's very hard to think about that when you're a teenager going through what I just described. Emotions are weird as it is with teenagers, right? Both guys and gals. And then when you compound it with a very dysfunctional household and, parents not living together and, lots of things happening, emotions are hard. And I think in the process of forgiveness, as you start to feel that pain, that's where the emotions come in. And you got to kind of allow yourself to feel and to be angry and to understand that your anger is valid. As you continue to grow up and encounter life. But guys aren't very good at emotions, at least from my experience. Most guys like to suppress those emotions and just kind of stick them into an area and not have to deal with them. So that was a huge process for me in working through this whole idea of forgiving my father.
All right, well, we're out of time for today, but, man, I hope that you'll join us tomorrow and invite somebody to tune in. We were talking with Jason Romano. He is the author of an outstanding new book called Live to Forgive, Moving Forward When Those We Love Hurt Us. So I hope you'll join us tomorrow as we continue our conversation with Jason Romano on Hope is Here.